Alright, now that we're finally this far into this little King series, let's finally go into Skeleton Crew. And the one I wanted to start with on that was Gramma, which has been adapted at least a couple of times. It was a Twilight Zone episode. It was the first season of that sort of 80s reboot of the Twilight Zone, and as far as I remember, it was a pretty direct adaptation. But unfortunately, I decided to focus on the feature-length adaptation, if you want to call it an adaptation. A movie called Mercy that came out in like 2014 or somewhere in there that Blumhouse put out. And I don't remember, we were reviewing stuff regularly as it came out in 2014, and I never remember hearing about it anywhere in that time period. So, but I've obviously seen it since, and I figure we can talk about it now, I guess. As we also talk about the short story, Gramma in itself. It is worth noting that this is, the director of Mercy has an interesting lineup, I guess you could say. He did The Haunting in Connecticut, which makes sense. But he hasn't really done anything since. He did a couple of episodes of Hemlock Grove the same year as this, and he hasn't done anything since, at least according to his IMDb page, and as far as directing goes. So take that for what you will. And of course, with it being Blumhouse, this is one of those movies that puts a bunch of witchcraft-related stuff on its poster and advertises itself as from the producers of Paranormal Activity and The Purge, which usually means this is probably going to be shit. So, when you look at it, it is another one of those movies that starts off like it absolutely has to get the viewer's attention right away. We can't really slow build to anything. We especially can't slow build to anything in this movie because this movie is extremely short. It is 79 minutes, an hour and 19 minutes. So you can see where they didn't really have a whole lot to add to adapting a short story except for cliches and all the other stuff that we know and hate when it comes to this type of movie in this particular genre. So, we're talking about it starting right away. We, of course, start in 1967, which I want to say, I don't know if it's directly specified, but I want to say is around possibly the time frame that the short story is set entirely. It's certainly not present day. They mentioned that their mom was born in 1930, and I think that's the closest we get to a timeline. So this kind of sounds about right, but it's just the opening of the movie, involving the grandpa's suicide that is brought on by whatever is going on here, whatever supernatural thing is going on here with the grandma. And the thing is he commits suicide by slicing his own head in half with an axe. Okay. So, now we jump ahead, and we meet the main character, who is played by Chandler Riggs from The Walking Dead, of course. And talking about this opening scene is kind of our transition into talking about the short story. Because we immediately meet him and he's narrating, and we see the relationship between him and the grandma, who is played by Shirley Knight, who we unfortunately just lost, that was only last month, I think. So, and this is like one of the worst movies we could possibly remember her by, but that's just how timing is. So, going into the short story and the whole thing surrounding it, we have the terror of the whole story comes from this sort of distance he has with his grandma, where the whole thing is that he has these memories that haunt him, where she goes in to hug him, and he describes like her skin and her arms, and there is always something that seems almost inhuman about her, and like monster-like. And it's always sort of terrorized him, and him being alone in the house with her upstairs. They're not even in the same room most of the time. When she's just upstairs sleeping and he knows that she's there, he spends the whole story in terror, and terrified he's gonna have to interact with her in some way or another. And you get an idea of how much they cared about adapting it when the very first line of his narration is, "My grandmother has always been my best friend." And we and we see the two of them walking around like they're in a commercial or something. Now, the reason I think sticking to the story was probably a better idea here is because we talked about how they're just going to go into the horror cliches. But what's interesting is Gramma isn't... It's another one of those ones that I can say isn't my favorite of the King short stories, or even one of them. But there's a lot of really good stuff in it. And he touches on a lot of stuff that's really interesting, that kind of goes into certain fears that we have or that we can recognize, especially from childhood. Where he... Like when he talks about the bad spells, which of course you could take in multiple ways as we quickly learn. And it almost kind of reminds you of, or I guess the movie would remind you of, when Shyamalan did The Visit in, I think, 2015, which would have been the year after Mercy, but when you go back and read the story, when they're kind of being cryptic at first about the grandma and her problems, it kind of gives you vibes of that. But then there's also stuff like when he's so terrified and he's so hoping that this window where he's home alone with the grandma while the mother has gone to the hospital with the older brother, the passage of time and the way that's portrayed and how we get to a point where he's under the assumption that surely an hour and a half has passed. And so he basically determines that, well, once we get to about an hour and a half, that's when I can start expecting the mom to come back. So if that could just be my safety zone, and we've got to be close to that. I mean, so much has happened, right? And he looks at the clock and 20 minutes has passed. And it's like, in moments like that, especially when we're kind of nervous or scared, is a really sort of relatable concept, and like a fear we can really... Like, there's something deep-seated in our minds that that immediately hits us in a way, with some sort of familiarity. And then when they talk about, when he's talking about how the older brother mentions about skeletons in the closet, and it's the first time he ever hears that phrase, and they're in their dark bedroom at the time, so his imagination, his child imagination starts to go wild, and he starts having, like, imagery in his mind of literally skeletons in the closet and stuff like that. And that's also something that I kind of remember from childhood, where you took phrases you'd never heard before very literally, and then you just came up with nightmarish shit by yourself, with no other help. There's a nice little... this story's only, like, 15 pages or something. It crams all this into it. And it's also got, when he's talking about sledding, and he says the place that they used to go sledding was Joe Camber's Hill. And it's like it sort of sets it in the same world as Cujo, which is really interesting. And just kind of a throwaway thing, but I still love it anyway, just the way he nonchalantly builds his universe. And I don't really get any of this out of Mercy. So, there's that. We've got, dog jump scares. We've got awkward stuff where you can't always tell what the tone is, because sometimes it seems like it's almost being tongue-in-cheek and almost trying to be humorous, but there's other portions that it takes so seriously and these things don't mesh at all, you're never quite sure. There's one moment where you can tell they're kind of going for humor, but then it just completely turns into this tornado of tonal fuckery, where it's a cut. It's one of those comedic cuts where it's like, the mother, who's played by Frances O'Connor here, says, we're going to handle... They're talking about taking care of the grandma now that she's sort of incapacitated, and she says, we're going to handle this with love and dignity. And as soon as she says that, it immediately cuts to them, like, struggling with her physically. Very loudly, and it's all over the place, and hectic, and all that. And then, once they finally settle that down, she breaks down and cries. So, they went straight for the comedic... From the comedic cut to something that could be a little bit scary to emotional. All within a span of, like, 60 seconds. I don't know what this movie wants. I don't know that anybody does, but here it is. It does have a couple of other notable people in its cast, apart from Shirley Knight or Francis O'Connor or Riggs or whoever. Joel Courtney is the older brother you might remember from Super. He was really good in Super 8. But he's not very good here, but I think that's the material, more so than him. But we do have Mark Duplass and Dylan McDermott, two of the most reliable people ever when it comes to doing their job and what they need to do. And Mark Duplass in general is an interesting choice to put in this movie, and it was kind of like a thing of his there for a second, because I think it was not long after Mercy came out he was in, what was that called, that Olivia Wilde movie, The Lazarus Effect, I think. And it's where he just did these horror movies that just kind of came and went, but he still brought his trademark authenticity to it, because the interesting thing about the Duplass character is he kind of sets up the uneasy vibe better than just about anything else in the movie. Because he's got that very natural vibe about him where he could just be any old guy that you run into or any old, family member or relative that you can just bullshit with or whatever. And he can switch back and forth in this movie between that and seeming almost sinister and maybe possibly threatening in a way. There's something incredibly off-putting to where he knows something, but you're not sure if he's against it or part of it. But either way, him informing us, there's something off about him that makes us uneasy. And the way he's able to kind of balance those things is really great, until he is unceremoniously killed off, and despite the fact that he's a family member, nobody gives a shit, because his death is only mentioned once after it happens. So, and even like the method of it is, we know vaguely what happened, nobody else seems to. And like I said, they don't really seem to care either. So I guess family doesn't always matter in this case. So there's even despite the fact that it's such a strong point of the story itself. The short story it's based on is literally called Gramma. There is a family theme here, but fuck it in this uncle's case, I guess. Then you've got Dylan McDermott as this confusing character where he's apparently he was a potential love interest to the mother way back in the day, and then it ended up not working out for one reason, and now he's back in her life, and he seems he's very Dylan McDermott-y. He's there, and he seems charming and likable enough, and trustworthy enough, but then, of course, he's probably not. Another kind of Dylan McDermott trademark. And he also has his own hilarious death scene that's never mentioned again after it happens. But by the time the movie gets to the end, it's trying to do everything and barely anything at the same time. And it's really, really wanted to reach that 79-minute runtime for some reason, and they struggled like fuck, and you can tell. They really ran out of ideas really quickly. So there's that. It falls into all the old cliches that we know about, like church and research. It's always going to be church and research in these fucking horror movies. Like every single time. And you've got, because that's the thing too, is you look at it and the story is based almost solely, the short story is based almost solely on the creep factor. That's what he was going for. The whole witchcraft thing is like barely there in the actual text. Like it's there just enough to set the background for what is probably going on. And then we get to like at the very end during the climax of the short story, then we kind of go full force into it. But it's really not until then, towards the climax, that we go full force into it. It just kind of little hints of it. But obviously this movie has to devote everything to the witchcraft thing and totally abandon the creep factor. I don't know. Like I said, they clearly didn't have enough material to stretch this out, since they barely clocked in 79 minutes, which is barely feature length. So that's what they wanted to focus on. They were like, well, we'll just use this safety net of all the cliches we know, and we'll just literally make that movie again. The end. There's also a lot of cases here where you can tell that The Conjuring had just come out the year before. I feel like some of these scenes aren't a coincidence, so there's that as well. So that's the thing, and you gotta commend Shirley Knight for the pretty physical performance that she has to put in. Not so much, like, the opening scenes are kind of there when she gets to actually be the sort of grandma figure, but for the rest of the movie, she does get something to work with as far as the physicality, but if only it had been a better project in general. So, yeah. So we talk about it's a terrible, terrible adaptation, and they just about abandoned everything about it. So that only leaves the one question of, does it at least work in some way as a standalone? But I think we already answered that. Not really. It's just another side Blumhouse movie that, before they really started getting a really good reputation, this was the kind of shit that was being put out. So that's yeah. So like I said, this is much more of I almost think that if the movie does serve one purpose, it does highlight the strengths of the short story to me. Because like I said, it's never been one of my favorites of his as far as the short stories go. But like I said, there's a lot of really good stuff in there that I really like that it touches on. And like I said, the fact that he goes much more for the creep factor than what it is that's causing it until it's absolutely necessary to go into that, is pretty well done. It's a well written story, but it doesn't, like, it may not immediately pull you in the way a lot of his others do. The way the movie tried to with its little axe suicide opening, but as you can see, that actually doesn't really work as often as you would think when you hear that sort of concept of starting a movie that way to get the audience's attention. You just end up embarrassing yourself, which is what happens a lot in this movie. So, and in just a mere runtime of 79 minutes, so many ways people involved in the movie can embarrass themselves. So, but good on King for the short story, anyway. So, the next thing is, I'm getting ready to do another Zoom video with my brother in like 2 hours. So that'll probably be right after this, and then after that, me and him have one planned for Friday that's going to be 3 movies. So we'll do that, and then just continue on with this Versus and King thing, and we're slowly building up enough movies, I think, to make a review video. I know Capone is out there now, but we'll see what happens. So until whatever the next thing is, that's it.